Thank you, Eden, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here back at the differences between former President Trump and Vice President Harris, thinking about the economic policy in particular, China-facing policy in particular, and what some of those differences are. So I think I've got control of the clicker and see if it works. There we go. Oh. And this is the 1-minute advertisement for the Asia Group, which is a growing and energetic consulting company providing advice to companies from really all over the region, including the United States, but also including Japan, Korea, and other locations. And we help them succeed in Asia. The agenda we have is to talk a bit about Harris versus Trump on China policy, and a bit about the congressional agenda going forward into 2025. So there really are several different categories. The USChina View on China has coalesced around the idea of a primarily competitive framework between the United States and China, and only secondarily, to a significantly diminished extent, cooperative framework, and in terms of the relationship between the U.S. and China. And that has evolved into the managed competition policy that we see currently under the Biden administration. What I'd like to highlight in this slide, and I won't run you through each point, is that there are still a range of debates on both the economic policy side and on the geopolitical side about how aggressive to be towards China and what the desired end state is for the relationship. So and I'm talking about Washington people and Washington thought leaders and the like, as opposed to other parts of the U.S. system. Within that Washington policy ecosystem, there are people who are actively advocating a Cold War type situation. And in the extreme form, there are people who are saying, well, we already have a Cold War, why don't we just go ahead and recognize that and pursue all-out competition without any support for more cooperative activity between the U.S. and China. But then there's another view, which is currently still the predominant view amongst most people thinking about China policy in Washington, which is that it is a primarily competitive relationship, but that competition should be managed. Okay? That's an important distinction. So then there are a couple of points where there is other additional division of opinion and some outlier views. So one of the outlier views is that the tariffs in particular are a good policy and need to be pursued vigorously in order to change the terms of U.S.-China trade. And change the terms of the U.S.-China relationship. And that's most closely associated with Mr. Trump. And then there's another outlier view, which is that the U.S. should change its approach towards Taiwan and make it more fully supportive of Taiwan's special status and more direct intervention in the China-Taiwan relationship. That's also an outlier view. I think that these are two really important points to consider. My personal view is that on the Taiwan piece, and I said this on TV this morning, that the U.S. is going to, regardless of who's elected president, the U.S. is going to end up pretty much in the same place as it is now in terms of its overall approach toward Taiwan, with some greater potential for volatility and discussion if Trump is elected. On the other outlier view, with respect to tariffs and decoupling, I think that there's going to be a big difference depending on who's elected president. If Trump is elected president, we're going to see high tariffs. in short order. If Harris is elected, we won't. But there are other things where there's going to be policy consistency. So, George, you can go to the next one. If you think about three categories of China policy and the differences between Trump and Harris resulting from that, the first, starting from the bottom, will be the question of pursuit of alliances. So the consensus within the Democratic camp and people surrounding Biden and Harris is that the most important way to compete with China is to strengthen U.S. relationships with its alliance, allies and partners around the region. And so that's why we see this incredible emphasis on U.S.-Japan relations, various trilateral formulations, Japan-Korea-U.S., Japan-Philippines-U.S., Japan-Australia-U.S., and every possible triangle is being superimposed on the region by the United States to try and strengthen those relationships. The occasional square, like the Quad, bringing in India. But really a very strong emphasis on that. For Donald Trump, in his previous term as president, he had a much more transactional approach. He wasn't philosophically opposed to this deepening of relationships, but he tended to want to get something in return for creation of those relationships. That slows down that part of the strategy in a Trump presidency. So people in Beijing are observing this and wondering, well, maybe if Trump's elected, the U.S. will be less effective at rallying other countries to assist the U.S. in competing with China, and that would be a good thing. So, thus, some of this ambiguity in Beijing about the U.S. election. The next set of policies up is on the technology front, where the Biden administration has really moved very far down the road towards a specific technology denial strategy aimed at keeping China behind the United States and its friends in semiconductor manufacturing, in quantum computing and other forms of advanced computing, and in artificial intelligence. And that is being done with a mind towards relative military power. If Trump is elected, he's going to do the same thing. So this middle category, the technology category, is actually, there's not a big difference between the two candidates. Harris is probably going to be better at it in 2025 if she's elected than if Trump is elected. But both of them will pursue that strategy. And the question is really how far is the strategy pursued, because there are trade-offs in denying technology out of losing business. And that push and pull between the business imperative and the technology denial imperative will continue to be a key dynamic in that part of the relationship. And then, as I said previously, at the top of the board, you have the Trump tariffs that are coming if he's elected. How high is not entirely clear. He has said 60% across the board on China. He's also said that he wants to put a 10% or a 20% tariff on the entire planet, which seems difficult to implement, both because of how markets would react to that, how Congress would react to it, how friends and allies of the United States would react to it, and then how the exchange rate would react to it. And you could do that and then actually end up, depending upon how markets react, having your tariff gain be erased in terms of its trade impact through the markets. So I personally, there's a big debate on this amongst trade policy experts in Washington. I'm on the side, you don't have to believe me, but I'm just telling you there's debate, and I'm on the side that he's not going to do that because I think it's too hard. But I do think that he'll do the China tariffs, because China is politically an easier target in Washington because of that competition mindset that is prevalent throughout the Washington thinking crowd, and because he can legally do it, and he won't get as much opposition. How high it goes is not clear exactly, because if you put a tariff on some things that you can only buy from China because they're only made in China, then you're going to have a problem. And then some sectors are going to be worried about retaliation from China. which will be a little bit of a tempering on the policy. But even with all that considered, I still think he's going to do it. And so people should have in the back of their mind as an assumption that if Donald Trump wins the election tomorrow, that he will probably triple or quadruple the overall tariff level on direct China exports to the United States, which would have a large diversionary impact on trade and investment throughout the region, which could mostly be bad for Hong Kong, but perhaps benefited in some ways if there are new deals being made in order to readjust those trade patterns. So, last slide I want to show you is about Congress and the activities that they've been up to. Believe it or not, the U.S. Congress in the 118th Congress debated 700, count them, well, it would take us too long to count, we'd be done by the time we count them, 700 bills on China. They didn't pass many. They banned TikTok. That's pretty much all they did. And last I checked, TikTok is a dance video app that probably is not really all that important at the end of the day. So the Congress is, what's the metaphor? It didn't walk its talk. It talked a lot and didn't really walk. But in 2025, I would expect, and perhaps even late after the election late this year, I would expect to see some more significant pieces of legislation passed. Some of them are a codification of White House policy, Biden White House policy, on the de minimis threshold, trying to stop Shein and Temu, and on the outbound investment restrictions, which would be more important to Hong Kong, and we can get into that in detail if you would like. The big piece of legislation to think about, again, goes with the tariffs. Listed up there is the idea of revoking permanent normal trade relations with China. Now, remember that back in the 1990s, the huge debate was about should China get permanent normal trade relations with the U.S. and back and forth, Congress and President Clinton and everyone. It was a huge issue. And then finally, along with China acceding to the WTO, that was granted as a package and as a permanent status for China as a member of the WTO. Now, if the U.S. unilaterally revokes that status, it's tantamount to withdrawing from the WTO. If the rest of the WTO continues to grant China that status. So that in itself is a very significant thing. And then once it's established as precedent that China should be treated differently from every other major economy, that will be a very big drag on U.S.-China economic relations. I have no idea how that bill is going to turn out, but that's the significant piece of legislation you should watch. There's also a piece of Hong Kong legislation that's pending that I think people know about that we can talk about if you would like. But in the interest of time, I'm just kind of getting this into a conversation. I apologize even for giving that lay down, but wanted to just get some facts out there or some analysis out there around which to speak. And then we can go in the direction of talking about the election, what might happen tomorrow, really anywhere people want to go with this conversation is fine with me.
Well, thank you very much, Kurt. I know that. Let me ask my second question. Is related to the election here. That for Kamala Harris, she has Tim Walz, who actually knows a little bit about China. Okay, and then for Donald Trump, he has Elon Musk, who knows a lot about China. So, would these two personalities have any influence on the policy of each at all, or you don't think so?
I think they might have. I don't know, to be honest. I mean, I don't know whether Tim Walz and Kamala Harris have had any conversations about China policy. My guess is probably not top of their agenda. But the fact that he knows a lot about China and has lived here, traveled around a lot, is probably on balance a good thing. I also think that Kamala Harris has an instinctive approach to issues of engaging and listening. She's kind of an instinctive engager. So I would expect to see her invest considerably in dialogues with China, as Biden has done, but perhaps even more vigorously as a somewhat, shall we say, more dynamic leader at this stage in her political career. And then Mr. Trump's transactional approach to China, I think, might also be reinforced by Elon Musk's transactional approach to China, where he's a business person who has managed to navigate some difficult policy issues in the PRC in order to have Tesla be successful there, and that requires give and take, and so he's been willing to engage with the Chinese leadership on sorting through problems that would affect his company. And so that, if he were to give advice to Trump on these matters, and I have no idea whether he will be in a position to do so, but I would guess that his advice would be, yeah, you can sort some things out, you just have to negotiate hard and get in there and mix things up with the Chinese leadership.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Craig, for joining us. It's always great to have you back in Hong Kong, especially on the eve of the election. Just on the question of the tariffs, whether the universal tariffs or the China tariffs, there is some debate as to what ultimately will be the purpose, and whether it is to with China specifically, whether it's to decouple the U.S. and the Chinese economies, or whether it's a position for leverage, thinking back to first Trump administration, whether there's a big deal to be struck, purchase agreements, something along those lines. Where do you kind of come out on that question? I think it's a little unknowable, but I'm curious your views.
It is unknowable, but it's worth thinking about and speculating about. So it's speculation. Because if the high tariffs are put on China and there are no negotiations as a result, then I think Trump would consider that a success, because he has changed the terms of trade in his mind in a way that moves the trade volume numbers to make it more, in his mind, fair. One of the interesting things about Donald Trump is his view of fair is outcomes-based rather than rules-based, right? And a negotiation has to be about rules, but maybe there could be a negotiation about outcomes, so we could actually get into a managed trade conversation with China. But whether we get into a negotiation or not, I think the China side is also a really important question, whether they want to get into that discussion, or they just do some counter tariffs and then leave it at that, and use other policies to compensate for the losses that result from the tariffs on both sides. Because tariffs end up hurting both sides. That's just what tariffs do. They restrict trade, so the exporter loses, the importer pays more. That's what happens. So I honestly don't know whether we'll get into that negotiation type situation or not, but I think one of the things that appeals to Trump when he thinks about this is that either way he sees it as a positive outcome. That he's adjusted the terms of trade in his mind, or on the one hand, or he demonstrates an opportunity to show leadership through negotiation and use of negotiating skills to reach an outcome that otherwise would not have been possible. So it's kind of a win-win proposition from his perspective as a political leader. Again, the tariffs are not a win-win proposition from the position of consumers or exporters, but from a political perspective, I think there's that's a lot of the appeal for him.
Two military flashpoints in the world currently. one in Europe, one in the Middle East. What is your view as to the differing scenarios whether person A or person B is elected? And how would that impact the U.S.-China relationship? And how would it impact Asia in general? And I'll tack on another question. The two potential military flashpoints in Asia, South China Seas, Taiwan, some people feel that those are non-issues. Some people feel that those are important things to look at. What are your views?
Yeah. So leave it to Paul to ask a really hard question. So it'll take me a minute to unpack this, but between Trump and Harris, the main difference in approach to the Middle East question will be the degree of their support for Israel. I suspect that if Harris is elected, that she will act more vigorously than Trump to try to get Israel to use less violence and more talk, and have the region be pulled back from the current seemingly inexorable walk towards greater violence that could actually lead to a war in the region and conflagration, which would be very bad for U.S. interests and perhaps even draw the U.S. directly into fighting in ways that would be very unwelcome to the American people. That difference is significant. And Donald Trump has, at least on the campaign trail, given rather unequivocal support to Prime Minister Netanyahu, regardless of the degree of his adventurism in punishing the Hezbollah and Hamas and now Iran from Israel's perspective. So that is important. On the Ukraine piece, former President Trump has said that he wants to solve the problem on day one. That's not going to happen. But really vigorously push towards a negotiated solution, which probably ends up resembling some form of armistice between Russia and Ukraine, perhaps with guarantees from other parties, which may or may not include China, certainly would include NATO in some form, would include the United States, in providing security guarantees to Ukraine in return for a cessation of hostilities, short of Ukraine's stated war objective of reacquiring all of its national territory. So that process being pushed faster, earlier, harder by Trump also has an impact on things. So on balance, I think China is much more interested in the Ukraine piece, and it looks at the Middle Eastern situation as a downside risk, that if there's conflict in the region, it's bad for China, but it really doesn't have that much agency, or doesn't want that much agency to try and get involved and resolve the situation. And then on the Ukraine piece, if there is peace, quote unquote peace between Ukraine and Russia, I think China will try and get involved in that conversation somehow. And then one of the impacts on China, if that happens quickly, is that the U.S. will in more concerted fashion refocus attention back on China, a lot of which is currently diverted by the Middle East and the Ukraine situation. And so China's, I think, probably thinking carefully through all this and then considering in an incremental way what it does in these situations. But it does have a certain impact. The relationship to the flashpoints in East Asia is not direct, but there is, I think, there's a school of thought among some in the United States that the U.S. should cede more ground to Russia on the one hand in order to make things harder for China on the other hand. And that school of thought is unlikely to prevail because it's sort of an unrealistic trade-off and it doesn't really reflect reality and how things work in operation. So my gut instinct is that regardless of how quickly the Ukraine situation moves towards an armistice, the situation in East Asia will remain stable, and the downsides of moving to a more offensive, direct conflict between the U.S. and China, in either the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait, the downsides of that far outweigh the upsides, and that both sides will continue to take steps to avoid that happening. That's both my hope and my belief that that's the case. I think the risk of some action is greater in South China Sea than it is in Taiwan because the stakes are lower, and it's easier to unwind it if it escalates than in the case of Taiwan. But we'll see. I think fundamentally this region is more stable than it sometimes appears.
Mark?